Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel MR.Creepy N. So today's video is definitely going to creep you out. In this video, we're getting into 4 true stories where spring storms became the backdrop for something far more terrifying than lightning and rain. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy this kind of content, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Alright, let's get into tonight's stories. I've lived alone since I was 23. I rent a small house at the end of a dead-end street in a mid-sized town that most people pass through without ever really stopping. It's not the kind of place that shows up on anyone's list of anywhere. It's just a town, quiet roads, a few diners, a hardware store that's been under the same family ownership for 40 years. I liked it specifically because nothing ever happened there. For 3 years, that was true. I work remotely, doing contract data work for a logistics company. My schedule is flexible, which means my days tend to blur together in a way that's either peaceful or lonely depending on my mood. Last April, I was finishing a project deadline on a Saturday afternoon when the weather shifted. What had been a flat grey sky since morning became something else in under an hour. The wind picked up in that specific way that feels less like weather and more like a decision. The sky turned greenish at the edges. I grew up in the Midwest. I know what that color means. I closed my laptop, moved away from the windows, and sat in the interior hallway, the way my mother had drilled into me since I was old enough to understand what a tornado watch was. I sat there for about 40 minutes while the storm peaked outside. Hail, then heavy rain, then the wind slowly backing off. By 7:30, it had settled into a steady, soaking downpour. Not dangerous anymore, just rain. I made dinner, watched something on my phone, and decided to go to bed early since I'd already lost most of the afternoon to the storm. The power had been flickering since around 6. It finally cut out entirely at 9:15. I had a flashlight and 3 candles in a glass holder on the kitchen table, which I lit before heading to the bedroom. I wasn't worried. Power outages after storms were a regular enough event in that neighborhood that I kept supplies specifically for them. I was lying in bed, not quite asleep, but close, when I heard the knock. 3 knocks. Even, measured, patient. The kind of knock that sounds like someone who was taught from childhood to announce themselves properly. I lay still and waited. The rain was still falling hard enough that I thought maybe I'd misheard something. Wind catches loose things and they hit surfaces. I know all the explanations. I gave myself a full 30 seconds to use them. Then it came again. 3 knocks, same pressure, same spacing, if anything, slightly more deliberate than the first set. Like whoever was outside was aware I hadn't responded and was giving me another clear opportunity. I got up, I put on the hoodie hanging from my door and walked to the front door. I did not open it. I spoke through the door and asked who was there. A man's voice came back. He said his car had gone into the ditch about a quarter mile down the road. He said the rain had come up faster than expected and he'd lost the shoulder in the dark. He said his phone was dead, that he'd seen my candlelight through the window, and that he just needed to use a phone for a few minutes to call someone to come get him. The words were reasonable. The situation was completely plausible. People go into ditches during storms all the time, especially on that road, which has a soft gravel shoulder that washes out badly when it rains. But something about the way he spoke didn't settle right with me. It wasn't. The words were fine. He spoke at an exact, measured pace that reminded me of someone who'd rehearsed a paragraph and was being careful not to skip any of it. There were no natural pauses, no false starts, no moment where you fumbled for a word. When people are cold, soaked, stranded, and scared, they don't speak like they're reading from something. I told him I'd be glad to make the call for him. I said my phone was nearly dead and I didn't feel comfortable handing it out through the door. But if he gave me the number, I'd try to reach whoever he needed. That part about my phone was a lie. He gave me a number without hesitating, 10 digits, rattled off immediately, no searching of his memory. I wrote it on the notepad I keep on the narrow table by the door. I told him I'd try and come back in a minute. I called the number from the kitchen, away from the door. It rang 4 times. Then a voicemail picked up. The recording said in a completely flat, unhurried voice, "Leave a message." No name, No indication of who owned the number. Nothing that would help identify a person. Just that single instruction. I didn't leave one. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, trying to decide what I was actually dealing with. Then I went back to the door and spoke through it. I told him I'd left the message and that hopefully whoever it was would call back soon. I asked if he was okay to wait under the overhang. He said that was fine. I went back to the kitchen and sat at the table facing the hallway. From that angle, I could see the front door and the thin gap at the bottom of it. Within a minute, I could see the shadow of his feet in the candlelight. 2 feet. Still, he wasn't pacing or shifting his weight. He was just standing there. 10 minutes passed. I watched those shadows and did not move from my chair. Then my phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. I answered. The voice on the other end was the same voice that was standing on my front porch. He said quietly and without any particular emotion, "Why are you taking so long?" I didn't answer immediately. My mind was doing several things at once. I looked at the shadow under the door. Still there, still not moving. I asked him how he was calling me if his phone was dead. There was a pause, not a long one, maybe 3 seconds. Then he said, "I found a charger." I hung up. I went. Story 2. She was already inside when the storm hit. I want to be upfront about something before I get into this. I am not a person who startles easily. I spent 6 years working overnight shifts at a psychiatric care facility, and before that I did nearly 2 years as a corrections officer at a county jail. I have been in rooms with people who were actively trying to hurt me. I understand threat assessment in a way that most people learn only theoretically. I say this not to sound impressive, but because it matters for understanding what happened to me last March and why it affected me the way it did. Whatever I experienced in that house unsettled me in a way that none of my professional experience had prepared me for. My sister Claire and I co-own a small rental property about 40 minutes outside the city. It's a 2-bedroom house on a half-acre lot surrounded mostly by open farmland on 3 sides and a tree line on the 4th. We inherited it from our uncle 4 years ago. He'd used it as a weekend retreat for most of his adult life, and when he passed, he left it jointly to the 2 of us, without much explanation beyond the fact that he thought we'd figure out what to do with it. We haven't entirely. In the meantime, we rented out seasonally, handled the maintenance ourselves to keep costs down, and try not to let it become a burden. Our last tenant, a quiet man in his mid-50s named Gerald, who worked remotely and mostly kept to himself, moved out at the end of February. We had a new tenant lined up for May, which left the property sitting empty through most of March and April. I drove out on the 2nd Saturday of March to do a full walkthrough, winter damage check, notes on anything that needed repair before the next occupant came in, the usual process. I'd done it enough times that I could move through the whole house in under 2 hours without missing anything. I arrived around 10 in the morning. The sky was overcast but calm. I let myself in with my key, left my bag on the kitchen table, and started at the top of the house the way I always do. Both bedrooms, both closets, the bathroom, the linen cupboard in the hallway, then downstairs, living room, kitchen, the small utility room off the back. I made notes as I went. A crack in the caulking around the bathroom sink, a scuff on the kitchen linoleum near the refrigerator. The back porch light needed a new bulb. Normal findings. Nothing that surprised me. I was sitting at the kitchen table, about 40 minutes after arriving, typing up my notes, when the weather changed. It changed fast. What had been a grey, still morning became something active within the span of about 15 minutes. The wind came up hard, and the sky darkened in a way that felt less like clouds moving in, and more like something closing. I checked the weather on my phone, and saw a storm cell had pushed forward ahead of schedule. Heavy rain, possible thunder, winds up to 50 miles per hour. The radar showed it sitting almost directly on top of the property. I wasn't worried about being there. I knew the house was structurally sound. I'd been through storms there before. I made myself a coffee with the supplies I keep in a cabinet for exactly these kinds of visits, sat back down at the table, and decided to wait it out and use the time to finish my notes properly. The rain started and immediately meant business. Heavy, straight-down rain that hit the windows like it had somewhere urgent to be. Thunder arrived close behind it, rolling in long, low waves that rattled the window glass in their frames. I sat there with my coffee and worked through my notes and felt, if I'm honest, completely content. There's something about being inside a solid structure during a serious storm that I've always found grounding rather than frightening. I was about 20 minutes into the storm when I heard the creak from upstairs. I looked up at the ceiling. The sound had come from the area directly above me, which was the larger of the two bedrooms. I know the sounds of that house. 4 years of maintenance visits, and I have spent enough hours in it to understand its vocabulary. The way the third stair from the top complains under weight, the particular tick the furnace makes when it cycles on. The way the kitchen window frame swells in humidity and scrapes when you try to open it. Old houses develop a language, and people who spend time in them learn it. What I heard was not part of that language. It was a footstep, one footstep, then a pause of several seconds, then another, the pattern of someone moving deliberately and quietly across a wooden floor, trying to move without being heard but not quite succeeding. I set my coffee down. I sat without moving and listened for a full minute. The sound did not repeat. The rain filled in everything around me, and I sat there passing it for anything that didn't belong. I should have left. That's the clear and obvious thing I should have done. I've asked myself many times since why I didn't, and the honest answer is that I convinced myself it was the storm, not because the explanation was satisfying, but because the alternative required me to act, and acting meant confirming something I wasn't ready to confirm. Instead, I went upstairs. I told myself I was being irrational. I grabbed my flashlight from my bag out of professional habit, even though the power was still on, and I went up the stairs. P.O. I opened the door fully, checked the closet, looked under the bed frame. Empty. I went to the second bedroom. The door was exactly as I had left it, closed. I opened it and stepped. I was 19 when this happened. I'm 26 now, and I still catch myself thinking about it, in quiet moments, usually when it rains, usually at night. I don't talk about it much, because the people I've told it to either look at me like I've lost something, or go very still in a way that tells me they don't know what to do with it either. Both reactions make me feel worse than saying nothing, so mostly I've kept it to myself. But it happened. All three of us were there, and all three of us came away from it, changed in ways that were small but permanent. My two college roommates at the time were Dana and Priya. Dana was from a small town about 2 hours north of our campus, the kind of town that exists mostly as a service stop for people headed somewhere else. Her family owned a cabin up there that they'd had for as long as she could remember. Not a luxury cabin, not a renovated weekend retreat, a real working cabin with wood paneling that had darkened over decades, a furnace that made a sound like someone clearing their throat when it cycled on, and the back porch that looked out over a stretch of forest that had no trails and no signage, and no indication that anyone had ever found a reason to go into it. Dana had been going there since she was a child. She knew it the way you know a place that raised part of you. She knew which floorboard gave under your left foot on the way to the bathroom at night. She knew that the kitchen faucet needed to be turned past where it seemed to stop before the hot water actually came through. She knew the cabin the way the cabin knew her. We arrived on a Wednesday afternoon during spring break of our sophomore year. We had no itinerary and no ambitions beyond doing absolutely nothing for 5 days. We unloaded groceries, claimed our sleeping spots, and spent the first evening on the porch watching the tree line go dark while talking about everything and nothing the way you do when you're 19 and temporarily free of every obligation. It was one of those evenings that feels important while it's happening, which is rare enough that I still remember it clearly. Thursday was unhurried and easy. We hiked a short trail behind the property. In the morning, came back muddy and satisfied, made a late lunch, and were settling into the slow drift of the afternoon when Dana noticed the spare key was missing from its hook by the back door. She mentioned it without much concern. Her family had an arrangement with the neighbors down the road, an older couple named the Hargroves, who had a standing permission to use the cabin if they ever needed shelter during a bad storm. The roads in that area flooded unpredictably in spring, and the Hargrove property sat in a low section that could get cut off. Dana's parents had extended the offer years ago and renewed it every season out of habit. Dana said she'd completely forgotten about the arrangement, until she noticed the hook was empty. She texted her mother to let her know we were there, and her mother replied, quickly said she'd already told Margaret Hargrove that the girls would be using the cabin that week, and that Harold knew he was welcome to come by if the weather turned. We thought nothing of it and moved on with the afternoon. The storm came in that night around 8:30. It arrived with genuine intent, the kind of spring storm that doesn't build gradually, but simply appears at full volume. Rain that came down in dense, shifting curtains. Thunder that arrived not as a rumble, but as a concussion, close and sudden. The power browned out twice in the first 20 minutes, and on the third flicker it went out entirely and stayed out. Dana knew where everything was. Candles were lit within 5 minutes, and the cabin took on that specific quality of candlelit interior during a storm, warm and bounded, the darkness outside made absolute by contrast. We were playing cards at the kitchen table around 9, candles between us, the storm loud and constant on the roof, when headlights swept across the front window. Dana looked up. "That's probably Harold," she said. "The way you say something you've already accounted for." She got up and opened the front door before whoever it was had even reached the porch steps. A man came out of the rain and onto the porch. He was older, late 60s, I would have said. He was wearing a dark rain jacket that was soaked through at the shoulders and a pair of rubber boots that he began removing at the door before Dana had said a single word of welcome. He introduced himself as Harold Hargrove. He said he was sorry to intrude, that the low road to his property was flooding badly and the water was moving faster than he'd expected, and that he just needed somewhere dry to sit until it passed, or until morning, whichever came first. He said it all in the direct, unhurried way of someone who has lived long enough to ask for what he needs, without performing embarrassment about it. Dana told him, of course, and stepped aside. He came in, set his boots by the door on the mat, and accepted the chair Dana pulled out at the far end of the kitchen table from where we were sitting. He held his hands toward one of the candles briefly, the way a person does when they've been out in cold rain long enough to want the warmth of even a small flame. Dana made him coffee. He thanked her by name, which seemed natural enough given that her family and his had known each other for years. He sat quietly while she made it, not filling the silence with conversation, not making us feel observed. When Priya asked him how long he'd lived in the area, he answered simply and warmly. "Whole life," he said. "Born in the next town over, raised here, never found a reason to leave." He and his wife had raised 4 children in the house down the road. 2 of them still lived within an hour's drive. He talked about the cabin with the easy familiarity of someone who had been inside it many times. He mentioned that the back porch light had always had a flickering problem. The Dana's father had replaced the fixture twice without solving it because the issue was in the wiring behind the wall. He mentioned the sound the furnace made. He said he'd always told Dana's father that the furnace sounded like an old man complaining, and that Dana's father had laughed every time he said it as though it were new. We played cards. He watched for a while, then accepted Prayer's offer to deal him in for a hand. He played carefully and lost graciously. He drank 2 cups of coffee over the course of about 2 hours and said very little beyond what was asked of him. He was, in every observable way, exactly what he said he was. Around 11 the rain had eased enough to drive. He stood, thanked Dana again with a specific warmth that felt earned rather than performed, and pulled his boots back on at the door. He said to tell her parents hello from him. Then he walked out to a truck I hadn't noticed until that moment, parked at the edge of the tree line where the yard met the dark. His headlights came on, swept across the front of the cabin, and disappeared down the road. We cleaned up the cups and went to bed without discussing it beyond Dana, saying she was glad he'd had somewhere to come. The next morning, Dana's mother called to check in. They talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, and then Dana mentioned that Harold had stopped by the night before to wait out the storm, that he'd sat with them for a couple of hours, and that he'd been lovely company. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not a brief pause, a real silence, the kind that has weight to it. Then Dana's mother said that wasn't possible. She said Harold Hargrove had passed away the previous November, a stroke, at home. I've only told this story once before, to my older brother David. sitting in his kitchen at 2 in the morning with the lights on, because neither of us wanted to be in the dark after I finished telling it. He believed me, without question, which is either a testament to how well he knows me, or a reflection of the fact that I told it badly enough that the gaps were more convincing than a polished version would have been. I'm a high school science teacher. I coached the swim team in the fall. I have spent 15 years teaching teenagers to think in terms of evidence and cause and effect. I don't embellish. I don't interpret beyond what the facts support. What happened to me and my son last April sits outside every framework I know how to apply, and I've been applying them steadily ever since. My son Marcus was 11 at the time. His mother and I had been separated for 2 years and divorced for 1. The arrangement we settled on was alternating weeks, which worked reasonably well for 2 people who had stopped working well together. That particular week was mine. We had no specific plans. Marcus was at the age where his company had become genuinely interesting, where he had opinions about things and asked questions that made me think. We were getting along well, that spring in the way that parents and children sometimes do, when the structure of access forces both parties to be intentional about the time they have. We lived in a single-story house in a neighborhood that backs up against a drainage creek. The creek runs along the rear property line of the houses on our street, separated from the yards by a chain-link fence that the city maintains. Most of the year, the creek is narrow and unremarkable, the kind of thing you stop noticing after the first few months of living near it. But every spring, when the snow melt comes down from the hills north of town and meets the seasonal rain, it swells. Not dangerously, usually. The city sends precautionary notices. Residents in the lowest sections are asked to move vehicles to higher ground. It has the feeling of a drill that everyone participates in without expecting it to become real. We had received the notice that Friday. I read it, moved my car to the top of the driveway as instructed, and checked the backyard. The water was up against the fence but not yet over it. Low and slow moving. I texted my ex-wife so she'd see it and not call in a panic, moved a few things out of the garage that I didn't want sitting on a wet floor, and went back inside. Precautionary. Routine. That was how I categorized it. Marcus spent the afternoon building an elaborate structure out of a set of interlocking wooden planks he'd been given for his birthday. He was absorbed in it completely, the way children are when they've found the specific activity their mind is shaped for. I sat nearby reading and checking the backyard every 30 minutes or so, the way you do when you're monitoring something you don't fully trust. By evening, the water had stabilized. It was sitting about 2 inches above where it had been at noon, but the rate of rise had slowed noticeably. I made dinner. We ate at the kitchen table, and Marcus told me at length about a documentary he'd watched at school about deep ocean geology, asking questions I couldn't fully answer, and seeming satisfied by the honesty of that. We watched something after dinner, and I had him in bed by 9, which was later than usual, but it was a Friday, and neither of us had anywhere to be in the morning. The storm that arrived around 10 was not in any forecast I had seen, not a passing mention of it, not a percentage chance. It appeared the way some spring storms do, fully formed and without introduction, and within 30 minutes it was the kind of rain that changes the sound profile of a house entirely. Hard, driven, unrelenting. I could hear the creak through the closed windows, which I had never been able to do before. A low, rushing sound beneath the rain that told me the water was moving faster than it had been 2 hours ago. I put on my rain boots and my jacket and went out to check the drainage gate at the back corner of the fence. It was the one structural vulnerability I knew about. The point where debris collected during high water and slowed the drainage enough to back the water up into the yard. I found it partially blocked with broken branches and wet leaves matted together into a dense plug. I cleared it with my hands, working in the rain for about 10 minutes until the water was moving through freely again. The yard was holding, not draining fast, but holding. I was satisfied enough to go back inside. I came through the back door, pulled off my jacket, and was drying my hands and face with a dish towel when Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway in his pajamas. He said someone was knocking at the back door. I looked at him. He was not frightened. He said it the way you report a fact, matter-of-factly, still half in the fog of being woken up. I told him he probably heard the rain. That rain on the back door's small overhang made a specific sound that could register as knocking if you were half asleep. I believed this when I said it. Marcus shook his head. He said it was 3 knocks, not rain. He said he counted them. I went to the back door and turned on the exterior light. There was a man standing in my backyard. He was standing in water that had come up to mid-ankle, maybe 15 feet from the door, in the full fall of the rain, with no umbrella and no apparent reaction to the cold or the wet. He was somewhere around 50 years old, wearing dark clothing, and he was looking directly at the door, not at the light, not at the window, at the door itself, as though he had already accounted for the light coming on and was waiting for the next thing. He was completely still in a way that struck me immediately as wrong. People standing in cold rain in flooded yards move. They shift their weight. They pull their collar up. They do the small involuntary things that bodies do when they're uncomfortable. He did none of those things. He stood the way objects stand. I did not open the door. I spoke through the glass and asked what he needed. He said his car had stalled on the low road 2 blocks over. He said the water had come up around it, and he'd had to leave it and walk. He said he'd seen the light on in the house and followed the fence line around to the back because the front gate was stuck fast and he couldn't get through. I want to be precise here because the detail matters. The front gate was not stuck. I had opened it and closed it twice that afternoon with no difficulty. It operated normally. There was no reason it would have jammed in the 2 hours since I'd last used it. I told him I understood, that I'd call someone to help, and that I'd let him know what I found out. He nodded once. He did not say thank you. He did not adjust his expression. He just stood there in the rain and waited. I called 911 from the kitchen table, keeping the back door and its window in my line of sight. I told the operator there was a man stranded near the flooding on the low road 2 blocks over, and gave her the address for reference. She told me they had multiple calls coming in from that street and that units were responding. She asked if the man was injured. I looked toward the door. He was gone. I told the operator to hold on, and I walked back to the door and turned the exterior light on again and looked out. The backyard was empty. I checked the gate from inside the fence line. Still closed, still latched. The latch required a specific upward lift before it would release, something a stranger who had never used it would not know to do intuitively, and certainly would not have been able to operate quickly in the dark and rain. I told the operator. The man appeared to have moved on, and thanked her. I hung up and stood at the back door for a long time, long enough for Marcus to come back into the kitchen and stand beside me and look out at the empty yard. He asked where the man went. I told him the man had probably found help from someone else on the street. It was the only answer I had that would allow both of us to go back to sleep. I went out the following morning when the water had receded and the mud along the fence line had settled into a firm, clear surface. My footprints from the night before were still distinct. They tracked from the back door to the drainage gate and back, pressed nearly an inch deep into the soft ground. The mud had captured them perfectly. Every tread of my boot sole, every shift of weight. There were no other footprints anywhere in that yard. Not by the gate. Not in the stretch of yard where he had been standing. Not along the fence line he had claimed to have followed from the front of the property. The mud was consistent and undisturbed everywhere except where I had walked. I stood in that yard for a long time and looked at the ground and tried to construct an explanation that accounted for what I was seeing. The light angle, the mud distribution near the fence, the possibility that the water had settled over his prints during the night and smoothed them out. I worked through every option I could generate. I am not someone who surrenders to unexplained things easily. It is not in my nature. I couldn't build anything that held. I had better exterior lighting installed along the back of the house 3 weeks later. I had the drainage gate replaced with a wider unit that cleared debris more efficiently. I had the fence inspected and reinforced at the corners. I told myself all of those things were already on the list, that the night had simply accelerated the timeline. Maybe that's true, but I know what put them at the top of it. Marcus brought it up once, about 6 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning drive to school. He was looking out the passenger window at the fields going past, and he said he'd been thinking about the man from the night of the storm. He asked me if I thought the man had been okay. I told him I was sure he was fine, that someone had helped him. Marcus nodded slowly and kept looking out the window. We drove another mile or so in silence. Then, just before we reached the school turnoff, he said it quietly, almost to himself, as though he wasn't entirely sure he meant to say it out loud. He said he didn't think the man was from around here. I didn't ask him what he meant by that. I've thought about it many times since. I've come close to asking, but there's a version of his answer that I'm not ready to hear, and until I am, I think I'll leave it where he put it. Out the window, somewhere behind us, getting smaller in the mirror. That wraps up all 4 stories for tonight. If one of these got under your skin, drop a comment and tell me which one hit you hardest. I read every single one, and I genuinely mean that. If you're new here, subscribe so you never miss an upload. We do this every week, and it only gets darker from here. Stay dry out there. Mr. Creepy N, out.